When you think of the Middle Ages, you might picture knights in shining armor, kings at grand feasts, or monks writing by candlelight. But behind these images was another reality, one filled with brutal, filthy, and terrifying work. Imagine being a gong farmer, climbing into cesspits at night to shovel out human waste by hand. Or a leech collector, standing waist-deep in freezing swamps, letting blood-sucking worms cling to your legs. Picture the life of a tanner, soaking animal hides in tubs of urine and dung until your clothes and skin carried a stench no amount of washing could remove. Or think about the role of the executioner, a man both feared and despised, whose job was to kill in public while living in social isolation. Even the night watchman, patrolling dark streets armed with nothing but a lantern and a stick, risked his life against thieves, fire, and unrest, for very little pay. These were the jobs that kept medieval society running. Everyone needed them, but no one wanted to do them. They were dangerous, disgusting, and often humiliating. And yet, without them, cities would drown in filth, medicine would lose one of its most trusted tools, and order itself might collapse. Let's step back for a moment and understand why such brutal professions even existed. The 16th and 17th centuries were times of rapid growth in towns and cities. Populations swelled, but sanitation, medicine, and organized labor systems lagged far behind. There was no modern plumbing, no police force as we know it, no hospitals with trained staff. Instead, jobs fell to whoever was willing or desperate enough to take them. For many, these roles were inherited, passed down through families because nobody else wanted them. Some carried the weight of social stigma. Executioners, for example, were necessary, but their families were shunned, their children often forbidden from marrying into respectable households. Tanners were pushed to the edges of towns because of the unbearable stench of their work. Gong farmers, despite being paid surprisingly well, lived in shame, mocked in plays and stories as symbols of filth. What's fascinating is that some of these worst jobs actually offered better pay than ordinary labor. A gong farmer could earn more in a single night than a skilled craftsman in a week. Executioners had stable incomes and sometimes even perks like free housing. But the price was social exile, constant danger, and in many cases lasting health problems. From the outside, it might be easy to laugh or shudder at these jobs. But to the people who did them, they were survival. If you were poor, desperate, or born into the wrong family, you had little choice. And every time a noble raised a golden goblet of wine or a bishop walked through clean streets, it was thanks to the hidden work of those who toiled in the worst professions imaginable. In this series, we're going to step into their world. We'll descend into the cesspits with the gong farmers, wade into the icy bogs with the leech collectors, and stand on the scaffold beside the executioner. We'll smell the stinking yards of the tanners, walk with the weary night watchmen, and uncover the brutal truth of medieval labor. Because history is not just kings and castles. It's also the people who did the jobs nobody wanted, and without them, the Middle Ages would have collapsed into chaos. If there was one job that symbolized the dirt and danger of medieval life, it was that of the gong farmer. The very name comes from the Old English word gong, meaning human waste. Their duty was simple to describe but horrifying to perform. They climbed into cesspits and latrines at night, shoveling out what entire towns left behind. Picture this. It's midnight in 16th century London. By torchlight, a man lowers himself into a pit several feet deep, filled with human waste that had been building for months. The stench is overwhelming, the air heavy with gases that could suffocate. With only a shovel, buckets, and sheer endurance, he spends hours scooping it out, hauling the muck to carts waiting outside. From there, it was often transported beyond the city walls and dumped, or sometimes sold as fertilizer for fields. Why at night? To spare the public from the sight and smell. Gong farmers worked while others slept, hidden from polite society. By morning, the filth was gone, the streets cleaner, and the people ready to go about their daily lives, without ever acknowledging the men who made it possible. It was one of the most dangerous jobs of the era. Many gong farmers died from asphyxiation when toxic gases built up in the pits. Others suffered from long-term illness, with their lungs and skin damaged by years of exposure. Imagine breathing that air for hours at a time, night after night. Protective equipment didn't exist. The only defense was a cloth tied around the face and a strong stomach. And yet, paradoxically, gong farmers could be better paid than many respectable tradesmen. In some records from Tudor England, a gong farmer could earn up to 6 pence a night, more than a skilled carpenter might make in several days. Cities were desperate for their work, and few men were willing to do it. Money could be good, but it came at the price of reputation. Socially, gong farmers were despised. Plays and ballads mocked them as symbols of filth. People avoided them in daylight, treating them as outcasts. They lived on the edges of society, often literally, with their homes set apart because of the smell that clung to their clothes and skin no matter how much they washed. Children sometimes threw insults or even stones at them. But without them, medieval cities would have drowned in their own waste. Imagine crowded towns like London, Paris, or Cologne, where thousands of people used cesspits and open sewers every day. Disease was already rampant, but without gong farmers, the spread of plagues and epidemics would have been even worse. They were, in a grim sense, unsung guardians of public health. There are stories of gong farmers becoming unexpectedly wealthy. One London gong farmer in the late 1500s reportedly amassed enough money to buy property, shocking his neighbors who despised him but couldn't deny his success. Still, wealth didn't buy respect. A gong farmer remained a figure of disgust, regardless of his earnings. What makes this profession even more striking is how it reveals the paradox of medieval society. The dirtiest job, the most shameful, was also one of the most necessary. Nobles could drink fine wine and priests could preach in spotless churches because, somewhere in the dark of night, a man was shoveling out the waste that made that comfort possible. The life of a gong farmer was dangerous, degrading, but essential. And it reminds us that history wasn't built only by kings and knights, but also by the men who climbed into pits so others didn't have to. From the cesspits of the city, let's step out into the wild swamps and marshlands of medieval Europe. Here we find another profession so grim and painful that it almost defies belief: the leech collectors. In the 16th and 17th centuries, medicine was dominated by the idea of balancing the body's humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much blood, doctors believed, caused fever, headaches, or even madness. The solution: remove it. And the easiest way was with leeches. Demand was enormous. From royal courts to village healers, leeches were considered a cure for nearly everything: infections, high blood pressure, fevers, even mental illness. If a noble fell ill, a physician might apply dozens of leeches in a single treatment. That meant someone had to supply these creatures by the thousands. Enter the leech collectors. Their job was as simple as it was brutal. They waded into marshes, ponds, and bogs, often barefoot or with legs uncovered. Why? Because the fastest way to catch leeches was to let them bite directly into human flesh. The collector stood still in icy water until the slimy worms attached themselves. Then, bleeding freely, he would peel them off and drop them into jars or buckets. Imagine standing waist-deep in freezing swamp water on a gray November morning. Your legs ache with cold. Your skin stings as dozens of tiny mouths draw blood. And you know you'll have to repeat this process again and again to collect enough for the doctor waiting in town. Many collectors carried scars on their legs for life, and infections were common. Some even fainted from blood loss. It wasn't only men. In some regions, especially in rural England and parts of Scandinavia, women and even children worked as leech gatherers. Chroniclers mention children being sent into marshes barefoot because their smaller size made it easier for leeches to latch on. It was painful, dangerous, and exhausting. But for poor families, it was income they could not ignore. Collectors stored their catch in glass jars or wooden tubs filled with moss and water, keeping the leeches alive for transport. A large haul could fetch a decent price at market. Physicians and apothecaries bought them in bulk, and nobles paid handsomely for what they thought was a miracle cure. Despite the hardship, leech collecting was oddly respected compared to other dirty jobs. Unlike gong farmers or tanners, leech collectors were tied to medicine. They weren't shunned as outcasts, but they weren't admired either. People needed them, but nobody envied them. And here's an ironic twist. While peasants bled themselves catching leeches, Nobles bled under their treatment. Some records show patients losing pints of blood in a single session. Far from curing, this often weakened them further. In fact, some historians argue that overuse of leeches may have hastened deaths rather than prevented them. Yet the belief was so strong that leech collecting remained a thriving business well into the 17th century and beyond. The job left physical and emotional scars. Constant exposure to cold water led to rheumatism and chronic illness. Cuts and infections from swamp life were a constant threat. And the sight of your own blood pouring into jars was not something easily forgotten. Yet, without these collectors, medieval medicine as it was known could not have functioned. Leech collectors show us another paradox of history. What was misery for the poor was luxury for the rich. The pain of peasants standing in swamps fed the health rituals of kings and nobles. It's a stark reminder that behind the polished image of medieval courts stood the suffering of those who provided for them. From the cold swamps of leech collectors, we now climb the wooden steps of a scaffold in the heart of a medieval town square. Here stands another figure whose job was as infamous as it was unavoidable: the executioner. The executioner's role was simple to describe but heavy to bear. He carried out the sentences of the law. Hanging, beheading, burning, even branding and mutilation all fell under his duties. In a society without prisons for the masses, punishment was often swift and public. And the executioner was the man who turned judgment into reality. Unlike gong farmers or leech collectors, executioners did not suffer from dirt or blood loss. Their burden was social and moral. They were both feared and hated. Townspeople crossed the street to avoid them. Children whispered their names as if they carried a curse. Families of executioners were marked too. Daughters often found it difficult to marry, and sons inherited the same profession whether they wanted it or not. And yet, society could not do without them. Every city needed an executioner. Without him, justice would seem powerless. His presence reminded people of law and order, even if it was terrifying. One of the strange contradictions of the job was status. Executioners were outcasts, but they also enjoyed certain privileges. Many were given free housing, exemptions from taxes, and even land. In some towns, executioners were paid more than regular officials, because few men were willing to take on the role. Their skill mattered too. A clean, swift beheading was considered merciful, while a botched one could spark riots. Executioners also had unusual side duties. They disposed of bodies, often burying criminals outside consecrated ground. They sometimes acted as torturers during interrogations, operating devices meant to extract confessions. In parts of Europe, they were also called upon for medical services. Because of their access to the human body, they supplied apothecaries with fat, bones, or hair, which were believed to have healing properties. Gruesome, but deeply tied to the medical beliefs of the era. Their work also carried a strange kind of notoriety. In cities like Paris or Nuremberg, executioners became figures of dark fascination. Crowds gathered not only to see justice but to watch the skill of the executioner. A man who performed his duty cleanly, without cruelty, could earn a grudging respect. A clumsy executioner, however, became the subject of mockery and anger. It's important to remember that executioners didn't choose their profession freely. Often it was inherited. If a man was condemned for a crime but offered the chance to live in exchange for becoming an executioner, he had little choice. Some accepted simply to save their families from poverty or disgrace. Over time, the job passed from father to son, creating entire dynasties of reluctant but skilled professionals. The psychological toll must have been immense. To take lives repeatedly, in public, under the eyes of jeering or weeping crowds, was a burden no one could truly carry lightly. Executioners lived with stigma, loneliness, and often guilt. But they also lived with necessity. They did what others would not. The story of executioners reminds us that the Middle Ages were not only about glory and honor but about the harsh realities of justice. It was not the noble knight who enforced the law but the isolated figure in black, standing on the scaffold, carrying out the orders of kings and councils. Leaving the executioner's scaffold behind, we now step into another world of hardship, not marked by death sentences, but by the everyday necessities of clothing, books, and food. The people responsible, the tanners and the butchers. Their work was less dramatic than an execution, but in many ways just as punishing physically and socially. Let's begin with the tanners. Imagine a yard on the edge of a 16th-century town. Wooden vats line the ground, filled with mixtures of animal urine, lime, and even dung. Animal hides are soaked in these vats for days to strip away hair and soften the skin. The smell is indescribable, a mixture of rot, ammonia, and decay that clings to the body and clothes. This was the world of the tanner. Tanning was essential. Without leather, medieval society would collapse. Shoes, belts, saddles, book covers, armor straps, all depended on tanners. Yet the work was seen as disgusting. Towns forced tanners to live and work outside city walls because the odor spread for miles. Even when they walked into town, people covered their noses or crossed the street to avoid them. The job was physically punishing too. Hides were heavy, chemicals burned the skin, and diseases spread easily in the filth. Many tanners suffered from chronic sores, lung problems from fumes, and shortened lifespans. And yet, demand for leather never stopped. Soldiers needed boots, monks needed parchment, nobles wanted decorated saddles. All made possible by those who lived in stench and misery. Now picture the butcher. In a world without refrigeration, meat had to be slaughtered and sold quickly. Butchers worked in bloody stalls, often outdoors or in open markets. Their job wasn't just cutting meat. It was killing animals, hauling carcasses, and selling portions to hungry townsfolk. Like tanners, butchers were considered unclean. Blood, guts, and waste covered their stalls. Flies swarmed, and the smell of raw flesh lingered in the streets. People needed their work but often despised the men who did it. Butchers were sometimes even accused of cruelty or greed, seen as men hardened by constant killing. Still, butchers were crucial. They supplied food for cities and not just the wealthy. Peasants might not afford prime cuts, but scraps, offal, and bones provided vital calories. Nothing went to waste. In poorer households, soups made from butcher scraps were a staple of survival. Both tanners and butchers reveal the paradox of medieval society. The very jobs that sustained daily life, clothing, food, books, were pushed to the margins. These workers were vital but treated as outcasts. Town charters often forced them to live in designated quarters, away from churches and markets, because of the smell and the stigma. And yet they held power in their own way. Butchers often formed guilds, controlling the meat trade and gaining political influence in towns. Tanners, too, developed skilled techniques that were passed down for generations, some of which survive in leatherwork today. The image of a medieval town often conjures cathedrals and castles, but beneath the spires and towers was the hidden labor of these people. Without tanners, monks would have no parchment for manuscripts. Without butchers, nobles would have no feasts. Their work was foul but indispensable. Our journey through the hardest jobs of the Middle Ages ends not in the filth of cesspits or the stench of tanneries, but in the silence of the night. When towns grew dark and the doors of homes were bolted shut, another group of workers took their place on the stage of medieval life, the nightmen and watchmen. By day, medieval towns were noisy and crowded. Merchants called out in markets, craftsmen hammered in workshops, children ran through the streets. But when night fell, cities changed. Darkness brought fear. Fires could spark from a single candle. Thieves prowled the alleys, and rumors of witches or spirits kept many indoors. To keep order, towns employed men to patrol after sunset. The night watchman was armed not with armor or swords, but with a lantern, a staff, and a loud voice. His duties were simple but demanding. Walk the streets, call out the hours, and warn of danger. Past 10 o'clock and all is well, he might cry, his voice echoing off stone walls. It was a reassurance to sleeping citizens, and a warning to anyone with ill intent. But the job was far from easy. Nightmen faced real dangers. Robbers often worked in gangs, outnumbering a single watchman. Fires spread quickly through wooden houses, and without modern equipment, The watchmen's only tools were buckets and shouts for help. Some towns also required watchmen to guard the gates, stopping suspicious travelers or enforcing curfews. Imagine standing for hours in freezing wind, listening for footsteps in the dark, knowing that one mistake could doom an entire neighborhood. In many places, watch duty wasn't even voluntary. Towns forced citizens to take turns patrolling. Wealthier men often paid poorer ones to serve in their place, which meant that the night watch was usually made up of the desperate and the underpaid. Records from 16th century England describe watchmen as old men, infirm or unfit, since few others wanted the task. Then there were the nightmen, who sometimes performed duties similar to gong farmers. They emptied chamber pots, cleared refuse, and hauled waste under cover of darkness, when their presence was less offensive. Their work was quieter than that of gong farmers in cesspits, but no less degrading. Nightmen were a reminder that the darkness belonged to those who did society's dirtiest jobs. Yet despite low pay and poor status, watchmen played a critical role. Without them, towns would have been far more vulnerable to fire, theft, and unrest. They were the first line of defense against chaos, even if they lacked the tools to stop it completely. The life of a watchman was also lonely. While others slept safely in bed, he walked deserted streets, hearing only the creak of shutters in the wind or the distant bark of a dog. Many feared not only criminals but also the superstitions of the age. Ghosts, demons, and witches were thought to haunt the night. Some watchmen carried charms or crosses for protection, blending their duty with faith. It's easy to overlook these men in the grand sweep of history. Chronicles celebrate kings, generals, and saints, but rarely mention the watchman with his lantern. And yet, without him, medieval towns could not function. He was part of the invisible labor force that held society together, just like the gong farmers, leech collectors, executioners, tanners, and butchers. Taken together, these professions show us a different side of the Middle Ages. It wasn't all knights and tournaments, but ordinary men doing extraordinary work under dreadful conditions. They endured filth, fear, and isolation to keep society alive. So the next time we imagine the medieval world, let's not picture only the castles and crowns. Let's also remember the men who shoveled, bled, slaughtered, tanned, and patrolled, the workers who carried the true weight of the Middle Ages.